Welcome back to another construct video, and in this video we want to be looking at flowcharts. This is a brand new feature that's in the beta version of construct right now, and what we want to do today is look at how it works, how to create your first flowchart, and is this feature actually any good? Let's find out. So starting on a blank construct free page, first thing we need to do is get ourselves into the beta mode. To do this, just go into the what's new option. We're currently on the stable version being R36 8.2. We're going to go to all releases, and this will allow us to go to the beta version. Now you can go to the latest beta version, or you can go back a couple of versions. Again, I think it's always best to go on the latest beta version because it has a lot of bug fixes, fixing some of the earlier issues. Hit launch, and then you've now got access to the new flowchart features. One of the other things I should mention in this beta version is there's also loads of great examples. They're really stepping up their examples. The examples of constructs have always been great, but these ones are just fantastic. And there are two around quests and a questionnaire as well. First one, if you insert a new object, you now have a new object called the flowchart controller. This allows you to navigate through the flowchart using events. The other feature that we've got is a new folder called flowcharts. If we right click, we can add a new flowchart, and once you've created a name for it, you can double click on it. It brings this weird grid pattern, and this is where we're going to construct our flowchart. So this is an example of a flowchart that I've made when playing around and testing with this. So this is actually for an Elder Scrolls style game. You can see we've got the location of Tamriel and 4 major locations in it. Now, coming off this, if we click on Skyrim, it's going to take us to this section here. This is where we've got the location of Skyrim, along with 3 major cities in Skyrim. If we click on option 2, we then go to the second option with 2 of the cities. And if we click on option 3 or 4, well, there's nothing coming off them yet. And we'll talk about what happens when we click on one of those. Back to Skyrim, if we click on Whiterun, you can see it takes us to Whiterun, and we get the options to ask around, shop, or go to the tavern. We can also go to Riften, and we've got very similar options. Then we've got Solitude with no options. Finally, on Whiterun, we can actually ask around, which will take us here and display this message, or go to the shop. And again, similar options for Riften. So how does all this work in practice? So we start off with our location options, and we can click on Skyrim. We can go to Whiterun, and we can go to the shop. And then we've got these little boxes that appear when we hover over an item. We can also go back. We can go to the tavern, which we can see is closed. We can ask around. We can go back again. We can go to Riften, do the same things in Riften. And then we talked about what happens if you click on an option that's not got a flowchart branch. Well, it doesn't do anything. What makes flowcharts so exciting is we could do all this before, but it used to take a ton of events and a ton of thinking about what leads to what. And if you want to change something, it was a headache and a pain. However, if we want to add a new location to this, for example, we want to actually add an option for Solitude. It's as simple as adding a new node, plugging Solitude in, changing the option to location. In my case, that's the way I've set it up. And then Solitude in, and then adding in some options. So in this case, I'm just going to add one option, and I'm just going to call it shop. Now when you go back to our project and go to Skyrim, Solitude, we've now got this new option called shop. I don't have to change any event or write any more actions to get it working, which means our flowchart can be any size we want and still use the same number of events. That's exciting. So at this stage in the video, you're probably thinking, well, how do I create my own flowchart? So I'm on a brand new flowchart page here. Again, you get this by just right-clicking on the flowcharts folder and adding a new flowchart, double-click on it to open it, and of course you can rename these. Now once we're onto the flowchart, the first thing I'm going to do is right-click and insert a node. And the node we get to begin with has got brackets around saying start node. Now this is a tree, so we've got a single root node or start node, and then everything must branch off this first start node. What can we do with this node? Well, the first thing we can do is we can add options, and each of the objects have an index value, 0, 1, 2, 3, and if we kept going 4, 5, 6, 7. This is one way that we can actually check and say, okay, if I click the option with index 0, go to the correct output. We've also got a name that we give this, and this is a tag that we look up. So in the Skyrim example, I used the location tag to set the name of the page that I was on. So am I in Tamriel, Skyrim, Whiterun? Or I had options. And these options must be unique to each other. They cannot be the same. If you try and set one the same name, you just get an error. Now, each of these options have also got a value. And this is the value that we assign to them that we can then use inside of our projects. And then finally, they've got an output. We can take another node and we can attach the two together. Now, when you're clicking on node, you can also edit all of this from the properties bar on the left-hand side. One new feature they've added is the ability to remove outputs. However, this does seem to crash construct at the moment, so just be careful with this. Again, I'm sure this will be fixed very, very soon. So let's actually make something together. Let's make a very simple branching dialogue system where somebody will ask you a question and we can have a number of different responses that take you to a number of different places in that conversation. But all conversations can go back to the start node, so we can begin the conversation again. The sort of thing you would find in games like Mass Effect. So we're going to start off and we're going to change option 1 to be the question. What is the person asking? So for this one, we're just going to say, and then it says option 2, 3, and 4 because we've changed option 1. I personally just like having option 1 as my first default one, and then 2 and then 3. So I think that's easier to manage. And then we can set up our different values. So these are my 3 responses. So how do you think? Nearest shops and where are you from? Again, very common questions you find in an RPG. And you can make these nodes bigger. The other thing we can do in nodes is we can give them tags. So this is just a way that you can tell the difference between one node and the next. However, I like using the first index value as the same job. But again, tags give you a second option to play around with. You can also rename the flowchart node. So you can go to the caption at the top and you can give this a name. So introduction to Bob. So Bob the NPC, this is the introduction to Bob, the first set of questions. So again, just another way to stay a bit more organized when creating these flowcharts. So going to our next node then, we can add a few options. And again, we're just going to have the option of question. And then we're going to think of what the question is going to be. What would you like? Again, very common RPG sort of question. And then again, we can set up our 2 options. Again, I like just converting these to option 1 and 2 because that makes more sense to me. You can think about better things to add in your example. And again, we can trigger different stuff off this. So let's add a new node now. And this time, I don't want the conversation to go any further. So I'm still going to have my question. And again, this is going to say about the attack. Speak to James. He knows more about me. And again, I'm going to link this up to option number 1. And that's as far as that goes. So what we can do is have that question appear, and then we can go back. This is the nice thing about flowcharts as well, is not only can we go forwards, we can go back to the previous node. So you can always keep track of where you are. So I've skipped ahead and added some more options. So first of all, if you ask about the war, there's now just a new option saying, how do you not know about the war? And we've done the same for the shop. We've just added a question with no responses. So again, just where is the shops? Now, the final bit I want to show you is actually setting up maybe a quest option. So where are you from? And if we look at the response, I'll tell you if you can help me. First, will you find a blue gem? So we've got deal, no thanks. So do you want to accept the quest or not? What we can then do is add in a new node. And this time, instead of option 1, let's call it quest. And then value, and again, Bob's gem. So again, we can use that value to actually work out what this quest line is. We can use that to trigger a very specific bit of code that appears on the screen. And then again, just as always, we just link it up, and that's good to go. Now, one thing I've not mentioned and doesn't really fit in this example, but you can actually link up 2 lines to a single node. So for instance, we can say, okay, if you said no thanks, then you go and you ask questions about the attack or the war. So again, this is ways that you could actually set up multiple paths to go to one location. Very, very useful. So now flowchart's ready. Let's move to our layout. Let's set up some other bits before we jump into the event sheet. So I'm going to keep this really, really simple. I'm going to insert a new object. And if you haven't already, you do need a flowchart controller. The other thing we're going to need is we're going to need some text, because again, we've got text being displayed at all times. So again, text box of some sort. And again, I'll make this nice and big because some of our text is a little bit longer. We're going to insert a button. Now, you can use sprites or other methods to trigger this. We're going to go really simple today. And this is going to be our option button. This allows us to actually select the option that we want. And again, I'm just going to place this in the top for now because we're going to get these to generate themselves. And then the final thing that we want is maybe a back button. So for some options, we might want to have the ability to go backwards in a conversation. So we're not always stuck in the same conversation. So yeah, that's a button. And just place that in as well at the top. And then finally for our back button, we'll just write the word back. And then that is all we need from this site. Let's move on to the event sheet. So first event that we need is just an on-start layout. And we need to actually decide which flowchart we use. And I say which flowchart because you can have multiple flowcharts. You can set up a flowchart for every different NPC, every major NPC that you're going to talk to in your game. You could set one up for each major location in your game. You could even set one up for a boss fight, and the boss logic can be done via flowcharts. Lots of different possibilities for this. But we've only got one flowchart, so it's going to be nice and easy. We're just going to do flowchart controller, start flowcharts, and then again, flowchart 1. That's the only one that I've got on my folder at the moment. And then these bits you can leave blank because we've not changed any of the tags. And then this set as current basically means that now when we refer to the flowchart, we're referring to flowchart 1. Next, we're going to add in a brand new event. We're going to go to the flowchart controller. And there's a couple of things that you should note when you're looking at the actions for this. You've got by flowchart tag, or by current flowchart, or by current node. So flowchart tag allows you to look at all flowcharts and then do a check on it to see, does it have this tag, does it have this name? Current flowchart is the one that we've started. So this start flowchart 1 means that now when we use any of these, it's only referring to that one. And then current node is just the node you're currently on. So lots of options that we can use when actually manipulating a flowchart, which is really, really nice considering this is still quite a brand new feature. Now, the one that we're going to use is this on any node entered. Now, what this means is when we move from one node to a different node, it's going to trigger a bit of code each time. This also triggers when we first go into the start node. That's really useful because every time we move from one node to the next, we want to change the text, we also want to change the buttons. So the first thing we're going to do is just add an action. And we're going to take our option button and just destroy it. We're also going to do the same with our back button. Next, we want to set the text box. So we're going to add an action. We're going to go down to our text box, scroll down, and set text. And we're going to go to flowchart controller dot output value, and then we're going to use the name value that we set up, which was question. Seeing is there an output called question, and then set that to text. So in this case, we can say the question is, how can I help you? Now in my Skyrim example, I also used the same bit of code to actually set the animation. So flowchart controller output value location, which had my different names of Skyrim, Whiterun, etc., etc. And then I just had an animation frame for each one of these with the same name. Next, we're just going to right click and add in a blank sub-event. And on our blank sub-event, we're just going to double click and go to the flowchart controller. So lovely option called has output, and you can basically check, has it got an output by a certain name? And again, when we talk about the names, talk about option 1, 2, 3, and question as our names. So in speech mark, just write option 1. And if it has got option 1, we want to generate a button for each of the different options. So we're going to right click again and add our blank sub-event. Click on it, and this time we're going to go to system and scroll down until we see the repeat. Now for this, we're going to use flowchart controller output count. This will actually count how many different outputs there are. Now in this case, we've got 4 outputs. We've got question, option 1, option 2, option 3. We don't want a button to be generated for question because we're using the text box for that. So we're just going to -1 from this count. So it isn't repeating the 3 times. So before we create a button for each of the options, we're just going to go to layout 1 and decide where we want our button to be. So I'm just going to place it roughly where I want it to be and then just keep track of the position. So 342 by 59. I'm just going to change these numbers to make them a little bit more round so they're easier for me to remember. So let's go 340 by 60. Let's go where our first button is going to start. While we're here, we can also add an instance variable. So just click instance variable here. And I'm going to add a new instance variable called output index. And initial value can be 0. Now the output index is going to be these numbers here. So when we create the button, we're going to store 1, 2, and 3. And then what we can use is do code to say, okay, if you click this button, trigger the output that's got 3 next to it. So option 3, we're going to trigger this output. So we're going to add an action, system, create object, and we're going to create our option button. Now for the X, we're going to set 340. And for the Y, we're going to do slightly different. We're going to do 60 plus, and then we're going to talk about the spacing that we want. So my button has got a size of 32 in height, so I'm going to go around about 40. And then I'm going to times that by my loop index. Now, what this little bit of code here is doing is going to mean that each button is stacked on top of each other. So it's changing the Y position by 40 each time, starting from 60. Finally, we can add in that instance variable as well. So option, button, go down, set the value of output index. And this is going to be the loop index. But again, we don't want to start from 0 because that's our question. So we're just going to add 1 to this. And then we should also set the text. We're going to do option button, set text, flowchart controller, dot output value. And this time, instead of putting in a string like we did before, where we put question, we can then instead just take the loop index plus 1, and that'll do the same job. So you can do either the name or the index value. And then the final thing we need to do just to get this set up is just add one more event, our option button, check when we've clicked it, and then flowchart controller, go to next node, and then it's going to ask for either the index or the name, so either option 1, 2, or 3, or the index value we added to the button. So we can literally just do the option button dot output index. Let's do a test. So this is what we're greeted with. We've got our question, how can I help you? Heard anything? Nearest shops, where are you from? So we click, heard anything? What would you like to know about the attack? Speak to James, he knows more than me. Now we haven't got a back button yet, so we're kind of stuck at this stage. You can start to see how the early bones of the project are starting to come together. What we're going to do is find the green loop, right click on it, and add in our blank sub event. And we need 2 conditions to this first bit. So the first one is going to say system, compare 2 variables. And we're going to see if the loop index, so how many times have we looped so far, is equal to the flowchart controller dot output count. And in my mind, this should be just -1. That makes sense in my brain. However, to get this working, I've actually had to do -2. I'm not sure why, but it worked. So someone can tell me in the comments. Really grateful because this one stumped me a little bit, but this way still worked. The other condition that we need to add is our flowchart controller has this option called is start node. Now we don't want a back button on the start node because there's nothing to go back to. You're already at the start. So I'm just going to invert this to say, okay, if you've done all the other options and it's not start node, add in a back button. So for the back button, we're going to take our system option, copy and paste it just here, right click and replace object to be a back button. The other thing we need to do is double click on it, and we're going to take the loop index and surround it in brackets. And at the end, we're also going to put +1, so the extra bracket. This just means it's going to appear 1 later than the current loop index, so it appears at the bottom. Now, All of this only happens if we've got the output of option 1. If we haven't got the output of option 1, then this doesn't actually work and we don't get a back button. So we can just right click and add this else to say that we haven't got option 1, and then we're going to actually just copy the option button again, not the back button, the option button, and then replace object, and this will place it in the same position where we'd expect to find our option button, right at the top. Final thing we need to do is actually make our back button work. So this is really simple. We just do back button, on clicked, add an action, flowchart controller, and then go to previous node. You've also got the option to go to a certain node or reset the flowchart so you can go back to the start. Again, we're just going to go to the previous node. So if we test it now, we've got heard anything. We can ask about the attack. Speak to James, he knows more than me. Press the back button. We can ask about the war. How do we not know about the war? Terrible. Hit the back button. We can go back again. We can ask for the nearest shops. We can go back. We can ask where you're from. And again, do we help? No thanks, or go back. This one, to be fair, we don't really need a back button for this. We could use the no thanks option. You can see if we click no thanks, I haven't actually set up any way for it to go, but we could link this back to the start node. And if we do deal, it'll take us to the quest side. So how can we trigger something based on a particular action? So what we're going to do is we're going to take this option here, has output option 1. I'm going to right click, add a condition and add an else. You can see we've got 2 else's now. What we're going to do is just right click and add another condition to one of them. Flowchart controller has output, and this time we're going to write quest. Now I mentioned the ability to set up multiple quests. So if we go to our flowchart, we can see that the value is Bob Gem. That's the quest line that we want to do. So what we can then do is right click, add event, go to our flowchart controller, compare output value this time. Again, the name is going to be quest, and we can say, is it equal to Bob Gem? From there, we can trigger what this quest line actually does. Now, instead of adding this as an action, what I'd personally do is just right click and add a function called quest, and then just go on to add action, function, and Bob quest. And then what this means is you can have all your logic for all the quests, but you can set the quest logic at the bottom, which just separates it from the rest of the flowchart. And this makes even more sense when you add stuff like groups as well, where we can take our flowchart and we can say, okay, has it got the output quest and is it Bob Gem? Start the Bob Gem quest. We can actually hide this, and then these are all our quests down here. So we have a big list of different quests. And then what we could do is choose what happens with this. So we could have an item that spawns or a doorway that opened. One thing you currently can't do, however, with the event sheet is that you change where these outputs go. What I would love is if we could actually change certain outputs to move to a different node. So once you complete this quest, when you next ask him where you're from, you get a different conversation that happens. And the only way I can think of this at the moment is to create a brand new flowchart. So again, the ability to change the values or where the outputs go would be a fantastic addition to this. Again, this is still in beta. There's still a lot of improvements I'm sure they're going to add to this. Final thing you want to do with your project is make it look nicer. So for mine, I've added a background. I've added a background for the text box, changed the font, and added in these custom CSS buttons. Let me know if you want a CSS button tutorial. Works exactly the same, apart from I've got the buttons going from left to right instead of up and down. This just is adding the loop index, the X coordinate, not the Y coordinate. Again, you can see, ask about the attack, speak to James, he knows more than me, ask about the war, and then we can go back again, ask for the nearest shops, and then we can even go to the quest option. So, and we can actually have it spawn in something. In this case, it spawns a gem, and I can even make it so you click on the gem, it does something else. But that is it for today's video. Let me know, flowchart, yeah or nay. Just a reminder, we've got the showcase coming at the end of the year, and I'll see you in the next video.